We're back with the Salem from the Salem newsroom, the Salem newsroom with sports writers. I'm going to start this again. Pretend to erase all that stuff. Hi guys, Paul Leighton of the Salem News and Dustin Luca of the Salem News, crack reporters, as Al Needham used to say. And gentlemen, welcome back. A lot to discuss, a lot going on in your towns and cities. Dustin, I actually want to start with you because we did a story yesterday. We didn't do a story. We did an interview with Caroline Enos. One of your colleagues, and she had published a story about the satanic building bombing. And what I want to ask you about, Dustin, she gave us some great detail on how the alleged perpetrator was arrested in Texas and all the background to that. What is the general anecdotal feeling about the Satanic Temple in Salem? Because I did read a representative of the temple mention that this happened totally out of ignorance. But I have to say the language, Satanic Temple, that tends to get your emotions going anyway. What's the general feeling with relationship to that building in town and that particular organization?
Yeah, and I thank you for asking this question, because it's when you mentioned offline that you wanted to ask a question about this, it's like, okay, interesting. And this is probably the number one question to ask, and it almost seems like an insulting thing to ask, because it's kind of like you might be playing into fear by asking a question like that. But I think that that's the exact reason why you have to ask a question like that. So the Satanic Temple, at least as far as I've heard from everybody, they are great neighbors. Nobody objects to them being in the city. When they first came to Salem, God, it was close to a decade ago at this point. I want to say like 2014, 2015. It was sometime around then when they first announced they were going to come. And then about a year later, they opened that space. There was a lot of, I can remember Josh Turiel on the city council basically saying, you know, there's nothing that prohibits this use. We really can't say no to the Satanic Temple setting up a headquarters here. So let's see how it goes and see if the fears aren't realized. And none of the fears were realized. They've contributed to programs in the city. One of my favorite memories associated with the Satanic Temple, actually, there was one Halloween where you had all of the street preachers that came out and were really doing their thing to, excruciatingly successful fashion. And the Satanic Temple actually came out with all of its folks and set up a human barrier around the street preachers so that nobody had to hear them, basically. And which to me was the ultimate. We ended up doing a story on that, and the thing ended up going viral. So the Satanic Temple, they haven't caused any issues in the city other than the fact that they're frequently targeted, which is not their own fault or anything like that. It's nothing that they're actively doing. It's just it gets to kind of what you would reference, where it's just the ignorance of the people. Because any opposition that's facing the Satanic Temple is not necessarily coming from Salem, because Salem has embraced them, welcomed them, and they've proven to not be a problem.
Well, I think the use of language, evocative language, is so prevalent in everything right now in all media. And it's interesting that you have fleshed that out for me. I appreciate that. I didn't watch a television show called Lucifer for many, many years. And then when I finally watched it, it was amazing, because the character who was supposed to be Satan was actually built around John Milton's character of Satan, which was a rather sympathetic figure in a way. And so once you get more information, I think it kind of helps in so many situations. All right.
Absolutely. No, I totally agree.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you for that. That's good to know. All right. I want to switch over to Beverly, and a story that I was telling Paul and Dustin before we started this, a story that was my first news coverage as a member of WESX radio back in the day, was covering the Elliott Chambers fire. And my mom had an uncle who lived in that building. He was okay. But that's a story that is so long ago, and yet here it is in the headlines again, Paul.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing, Rick. So this fire took place in 1984. It was at a rooming house called Elliott Chambers. So it's called the Elliott Chambers fire. 15 people died. It's funny because you mentioned that you actually covered it. I remember I was in Oregon at the time, and I remember that it was the lead story on the national news, this fire in Beverly. And so this guy called James Carver was convicted setting the fire and 15 counts of second-degree murder. He's been in prison since 1989 is actually the year that he was convicted. And so he's seeking a new trial. It's the 5th time he's tried for a new trial. He's obviously been unsuccessful the 4 previous times, but this time is a little different. I went to 2 of the hearings up in Lawrence that were held over the last couple of weeks for a judge to decide whether he deserves a new trial or not. But Carr is being represented by lawyers from the Innocence Project, one from the Public Defender's Office, one from Boston College. They have these programs where they defend people. And their point is that there is new science surrounding both fire investigations and witness testimony. There's been studies that show, they say, the unreliability of witness accounts, depending on the conditions and the time period and how they're questioned by police and all that. And the fire science was kind of interesting because the theory is that Carver, who was, I think, 20 years old at the time, the prosecutors say that he set the fire because he was jealous that his ex-fiancée was dating somebody who lived at the rooming house, and that he set a bunch of newspapers on fire in the foyer of the building, and it went up and caused this terrible fire. But they said that there's new evidence. It's a bit technical that the fire was not set in this stack of newspapers, that it might have been electrical and started overhead. And they say that he deserves a new trial because this type of knowledge wasn't around in 1989 when he underwent the trial. So they're trying to get a new one. There won't be a decision probably for a couple of months. But I mean, the only image I had of this James Carver was the same photo that the Salem News has run for years from his trial back in the 80s when he was a young man. And I saw him being wheeled in. I think he's 60 years old now, and he's in a wheelchair. And he was there for all the hearings too. So we'll see what happens. 40 years later, it's still in the news.
Oh, as I remember, was that an old building? It was on top of a pharmacy or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, it was on top of a drugstore, Davis Drug, and it's right on the corner of Rantoul and Elliott Streets. There's a CVS there now. It's been there for a while. And there's actually a memorial right on that corner that was for the victims of the fire that was set up about 10 years ago. I remember covering that when that was first unveiled. So in the fire, 15 people died, which is obviously a terrible tragedy, but the fire is also significant. It did lead to new rules in terms of sprinkler requirements for sprinklers and smoke detectors and other fire prevention methods in these rooming houses. So it had it's had a lot of significance over the years.
Yeah, I forgot about that, so I'm glad you brought that up too. Yeah, that was a huge thing after the fire. Dustin, I want to go back to Salem for a second and maybe sort of I don't know, as a sidebar to what we talked about earlier. Salem recently had a visitor, a Holocaust survivor talk, and I know that there was a former resident from Peabody who passed away earlier a few years ago who used to come to Gloucester all the time and talk to the kids about it. And tell me about the experience in Salem.
Yeah, this was really an event that really touched your heart in a number of different ways if you had a chance to actually go to it. Andrei Sarkany is a Holocaust survivor. Actually, he's survived not just the Holocaust, but also the communist occupation of the country that he lived in at the time. And there was a lot of different aspects to, of course, you have the story of, he's having to hide, he's having to suppress the fact that he is Jewish. He's going to a school that serves Jewish students, and this is all happening in the time of the Nazi occupation of Poland. And he still manages to get through that, and then kind of once he moves to the United States, embarks on a quest to basically tell the stories of how he managed to survive. And one of the things that was really provocative, that was impressive, as the truck just goes screaming by. One of the things that was really, really provocative that he said that I've just been kind of repeating in my mind, and I even used this, I think, as the lead on it, was to never use the word hate. he talked about how a lot of people, specifically in our society, will use the word hate to describe something that they have mild disagreement with, like, oh God, I hate that brand of paper, or you know, I hate how much a toner cartridge costs, or something like that. You know, it's a using the word hate, which to him has a radically different meaning, because he survived at the behest of hate. And so one of the things that he kind of pledged is that we as a society should do everything we can to try to find different ways of using a word other than hate. You know, like, oh, I dislike this, or something like that, or look, just say something positive. And there was a lot of lessons that he kind of shared, kind of from that lens of, you know, this is what I experienced, and this is how you all can evolve as a society, you know, having heard my experience.
Yeah, and I remember reading your story about that and how impactful that was, because as a former student of linguistics, I didn't get quite my master's degree, but the language is just so important, as we mentioned earlier, in evoking emotions. Before we turn it back over to Paul, let me ask you about something that you mentioned in our pregame warm-up here, something going on with the planning board and the ACLU in Salem. What's that
Yeah.
all about?
So there's been kind of a thing going on. A couple of weeks ago, Salem's planning board had a hearing going for 75 North Street, which is a housing project that's kind of right in the middle of a floodplain. And one thing that's really interesting about this project, and why I enjoyed covering it actually, and I plan to continue covering it, is because they're literally building a building right in the middle of an area that's prone to flooding, and they have aspects of the design that respond to the fact that, yeah, this entire property is going to be underwater possibly multiple times a year. So, you know, in that process, there were two residents who were muted because they were kind of raising concerns about the project, and then sparring with the chairperson of the board, Bill Grissett, over the right to speak. And in both cases, the resident was muted. This is a meeting that was held remotely on Zoom only, so there was no in-person variant or anything like that. And this kind of immediately harkened back to the Supreme Judicial Court decision last year, Barron versus Kalenda, which basically said that public bodies can't mute somebody or can't shut down somebody's right to speak simply because they don't like what they're hearing. So it's kind of, you know, there has to be other reasons, like there has to be, you know, you're doing harm to somebody, you're interrupting the decorum of the process. There could be these different things that they can, you know, shut somebody down for, but simply because you don't like the fact that they said they feel the zoning board decision was illegal, that's not enough of a reason. So the way that this turned into news this past week was that the ACLU actually reached out to Bill Grissett and said, actually, what you did there was wrong, and we would really like it if you apologize publicly and share this letter with the rest of the board, which he did last night. So planning board met yesterday. Grissett read portion of the letter and issued a formal public apology to the two residents that were muted, which were Justin Whittier and Stacia Kraft. So that's kind of where that's going right now. Planning board's not due to talk about the 75 North project until the first meeting in May. And one of the other things that Grissett had said was that they're going to be intentionally extending an invite to the folks that were muted so that they would give an opportunity to them to speak, just in light of
All
what
right.
happened. So
Great coverage. Great coverage. Thank you. All right, Paul, let's go back to Beverly here. Housing crisis is everywhere. Tell me about your latest coverage.
Yeah, the other week I covered lottery to see who's going to be able to get into the latest affordable housing development in Beverly. And so this is, the project is they're turning the former Briscoe School building in Beverly into 85 units of senior affordable housing. And about 500 people, you know, originally applied for these 85 positions. So this is something that's happening all over the state. I don't know if I quite realized how it worked, but the state does, depending on the funding you get, they require that these developers hold, you know, lotteries to see who gets an apartment. So I finally got a chance to cover one at the senior center in Beverly the other night. You know, Harbor Light Homes is the nonprofit that's been doing a lot of affordable housing on the North Shore, and they're the ones in charge of this development. So they held a lottery at the senior center. About 40 people showed up. They literally picked numbers out of a glass jar, and the numbers they pick, it doesn't guarantee that you will get in. It was a little bit of a confusing process, but it moves you toward the top of the list. So it is, you know, it enhances your chances of getting in. So I went there and I talked to some people who got a high number, which means they have a really good chance to get in, and others who didn't. But to me, it just reflects. And I spoke with Andrew DeFranza, the head of Harbor Light Homes, and he said it's like mixed feelings, because it's kind of hard to believe that it's come to the point for people to find a place to live. They rely on you picking the number out of a jar. He said that's pretty sad, but it's also nice to see people, so excited to have this chance to live in this place. I actually went on a tour of this Briscoe building. It's scheduled to open in the fall, so it's under construction. And I mean, I went to school there quite a while ago when it was a junior high school. My father went there, my daughters went there. So, but they're keeping some of the chalkboards actually and other elements of the classrooms, and they're turning into house. So it's going to be a really nice place, but it just shows how difficult it is to find a place when you have 500 people applying for 85 apartments.
Yeah, I've been through something like that with a family member, and it's pretty strange. And I also know we covered Mayor Pangello's whatever it was announcement concerning, or his potential program concerning homeless tents and stuff in Salem. And I was talk about a learning process. People who were advocating for the homeless said you just can't push them off public land and make them criminals because they're how do they because they're homeless. And it's like boy, is that it's getting more and more into the public conscience, I think, hopefully. And finally, a couple more things with each of you. One more thing with you, Paul. A story that just won't go away, and it's thanks to your intrepid reporting and investigative coverage, is the Varian cleanup, and on it goes.
Yes, there's a lot of progress being made. That's the good news. So this is the site in Beverly, this former industrial site that has a lot of contamination underground in the groundwater. The company says, and the state says, nobody's gotten sick or hurt or died from this over the years, but this cleanup has been going on for 40 years of trying to get rid of these toxic chemicals that are underground in the groundwater, so they're tough to get rid of. There is a danger that they're migrating into the neighborhood, and so they're under the houses, and people are worried that this stuff can vaporize and get into their homes. In one house, they had to install the system to prevent these chemicals from getting into their homes. So this is 40 years after they've started cleaning it up. But as I said, I wrote a story a few years ago, brought more attention to it. There's been a lot of pressure on the company, Varian, which is now based in California and actually doesn't own the land anymore, but they're still responsible to clean it up. But the bottom line is they have all these new techniques. They're spending millions of dollars with different ways to get rid of these chemicals. They're going to superheat the ground, underneath, and that causes to come in, capture the chemicals and truck them off site. And there's 3 or 4 different ways, and they have these updates every few months with the public, which is something they stopped doing years ago, which they shouldn't have stopped doing, but they're doing it now. There are a lot of eyes on it. They are spending millions of dollars now that they weren't spending to get rid of these chemicals. And I think that residents and public officials are pretty satisfied with the progress they're making, but they're still keeping a close eye on things to make sure they get it done.
Interesting. And Dustin, Salem is looking for a poet laureate.
Yeah, this is kind of a wild thing. And you mentioned Mayor Pangallo a couple minutes ago. This was something that he kind of very quietly announced back during the inaugural ceremonies for the rest of the body and for the city council. He gave his State of the City, and he talked about how they were going to be doing a poet laureate initiative. So now that we are in National Poetry Month, they've announced it. They're looking for the applicants that are interested in becoming the city's first poet laureates, and that gets all kinds of little things. You get a small stipend, you get to hold certain readings throughout the year. You're also expected to kind of hold workshops and kind of help people write poetry and learn how to write poetry, and using that medium as a way to express yourself. So the application window is now in effect, and it runs, I think, until May 31st or something like that. So anybody who's interested in possibly being named Poet Laureate of the City of Salem, the official Poet Laureate from now until January 1, 2026, which, by the way, are going to be 2 very big years, because you're also crawling right up to the the 400th anniversary. So just thinking about the opportunity to be the poet laureate of the city of Salem is kind of insane, especially when you look at it from that historical context. So if you're looking to learn more, it's all on the city website.
All right. I got a loaded question for both of you as we wrap this up. So stand by. Okay. I'd like to know, I know you get assignments of stories that you want to cover, but what happens when something else overrides that? In other words, it's like a triage. That event that you had lined up to cover, how often do you have to just kind of kick that down the road a little bit and then go to the most I don't know, important one at the moment? How often does that happen, Dustin?
I've got a great answer for this one that ties into both Beverly and Salem. And it doesn't happen that often. More often, what ends up happening is we end up covering an event and then something else happens that causes a shift on the front page where we'll still write the story, but it might get held today or something like that just to try to get something else up front. So that's one way it gets dealt with. But I can actually remember my first month working at the Salem News. At the time, I was actually the Beverly reporter. And my grandmother grew up in Beverly and lived on Bald Street, right across the street from the McKay School. And I was lined up for this great assignment where I was going to go in there, and they had apparently discovered a time capsule to the McKay School while they were actively redeveloping it for the condos and townhouses that are there now. And I was so excited because it's like, yeah, right across the street from where my grandmother was, where I grew up. I lost so many balls on that roof. I'm going to get to go inside there. And then somebody ended up accidentally killing themselves with a homemade bomb in Salem, where I had to all of a sudden jettison from the assignment I was driving to so I could go meet Kim Driscoll and Paul Tucker for the first time, meet Konrad Prozniewski for the first time, because this was a massive, massive story in Salem when this guy was working with homemade devices, and then one unfortunately went off right in his face, and it ended the story real quick, but still created this absolute nightmare of situation for, basically the entire Canal Street region of Salem, because nobody knew what was going on at the time. So that's like the ultimate example to me in terms of you going in saying, I'm going to have this great story, and then something else happening that just pulls you right out of it.
It's funny you're mentioning the big three in Salem. As a young reporter, I was talking to you guys earlier about my meeting Jack Hines when I was first at ESX. I think I just mentioned that, and it's like, wow. I mean, three great people, and all three still active, very active, of course, as everybody knows.
And this was, I want to say, 3 weeks before Paul Tucker won his state rep seat. So this is before he becomes DA. This is when he was still police chief of the city of Salem.
Yeah, well, we had then Sergeant Prozniewski on many times back in the day on WESX. And thank you, man. That's a good story. Paul, what about you? How does stuff get moved around?
No, that's a great question, Rick, because it's kind of the the dilemma of the smaller newspapers that don't have as big staff. So for me, I always want to be working on like a bigger story that takes more time, that might be more investigative or is some big issue, but we don't have but we still have to cover the day-to-day stuff like Dustin said. So I'm working on the story now. I think it's going to be published on Monday. It had to do with a court case, and anyway, it went on, and we, with my editor, John Castelluccio, we decided we were going to devote the time. I've spent like 3 full days in court over the last 3 weeks, covering this issue. And at the end of the day, I don't have any story because we're going to wait till it ends and write one big story. And that's a lot of time and resources for, newspaper that basically has 5 reporters that I can sit in court for 3 days and not write a story and leave Dustin and all my colleagues to fill the paper that day, But we committed to that because we think it's worth a story. And then, so I'm starting to write it now. But this morning at 8 o'clock, I was out at a fire in Beverly and covered that, and already took a photo and wrote a story, and it's up on our website now, But that's common. That's how we do it. But it's that balance between the big stories that me, personally, who's been around a long time and has done a lot of those other stories already, to be perfectly honest. I would like to spend all my time doing investigative stories. We don't have a spotlight team, Dustin's the spotlight and I'm the spotlight. We're all our own spotlights. So so it's always that balance between those two types of stories.
Great. That's great to know. And I think, as the great unwashed sitting back, complaining about this or that in the newspaper, to understand how that works. And to me, it speaks to the teamwork of your staff, that you all seem to really be able to work very well together and off of each other.
Oh
No,
yeah,
I
but
think-
and you
Yeah.
sorry, go ahead.
Well, see, except now when we're talking over each other, that's the only. No, but it's true. We're not, territorial in any way. When I first started, not to talk about back in the day, I mean, we'd have, 3 reporters covering Salem and 2 reporters covering Beverly, and you kind of stuck to your beat. And Dustin covers Salem and does a great job. I cover Beverly. Caroline does Peabody, and Michael McHugh does Danvers. But there's plenty of crossover. Like Dustin said, Caroline, just because of circumstances, covered the arrest of the guy accused of the satanic temple incident. So anyway, we have plenty of crossover out of necessity, and I think we are good that way.
And that's exactly the point that I was going to make, just in regards to Caroline being the one that was interviewing in regards to, Satanic Temple incidents. So that was the ultimate example. It's like, this is all happening. I think that arrest was announced at like 6 o'clock, and Caroline was like, "Hey, just so you know, this is going on," and I was like, "Oh God, I can't handle this." And she was like, "I'm still working. You want me to jump on it?" I'm like, "Yes, please."
Oh,
So
good. Yeah.
that happens all the time between us. I mean, the ways that we cross lines, and it doesn't help also that like Harbor Light is working in every single city, and North Shore CDC is now working in every single city. You're getting the organizations are even starting to overlap, where the shelters are kind of in a partnership with each other and everything like that. So that's constantly giving us the opportunity to kind of cross our beat lines and kind of get to play in Salem for a day, get to play in Beverly for a day, or something like that.
We are lucky to have all of you.